Governor Evelyn Harper was not your typical politician. Unlike many leaders who stayed behind closed doors or relied on aides to interact with the public, she believed in getting her hands dirty. For her, leadership wasn't about sitting in a fancy office. It was about being present where the people were. That's why, on a crisp autumn morning, she found herself walking into a small community center in a quiet suburb. The town had been making headlines recently, not for anything positive, but because of growing tensions between residents and law enforcement. People were frustrated, scared even, and Governor Harper wanted to hear their concerns firsthand. Evelyn didn't arrive with flashing lights or a team of bodyguards. She left all that behind, choosing instead to blend in as just another concerned citizen. Her dark blazer and simple slacks helped her fade into the crowd. No one gave her a second glance as she took a seat near the back of the room. Around her, people whispered anxiously about what might happen during the meeting. Flyers advertising the event promised open dialogue, but everyone knew emotions were running high. Some attendees hoped for answers, while others seemed ready to vent years of pent-up anger. The room itself was modest, a plain rectangular space with folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. A podium stood at the front, flanked by 2 American flags. It looked like any other community gathering, except for the palpable tension hanging in the air. As more people filed in, the murmurs grew louder. Someone mentioned rumors of protests outside, while another person complained about outsiders trying to stir up trouble. Evelyn listened quietly, taking mental notes. She could feel the weight of unspoken grievances pressing down on the room. When the meeting finally began, a local organizer stepped up to the podium to welcome everyone. His voice wavered slightly as he urged calm and respect. Then, one by one, residents approached the microphone to share their thoughts. Some spoke passionately about feeling targeted by police officers. Others talked about wanting safer neighborhoods without sacrificing fairness. Each story painted a picture of a community caught between fear and frustration. Evelyn nodded along, her expression thoughtful but neutral. She knew these issues weren't unique to this town. They mirrored challenges faced across the state. As the meeting progressed, Evelyn felt a growing urge to speak. She hadn't come here just to listen. She'd come to contribute. After all, she had spent years working on policies aimed at bridging divides between communities and law enforcement. This was her chance to connect with real people, to show them that someone in power truly cared. When the floor opened for general comments, she stood up slowly, smoothing her jacket as she made her way to the microphone. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Evelyn introduced herself with a warm smile, explaining that she was the governor and expressing gratitude for being allowed to join the discussion. But before she could say more, something unexpected happened. Something that would change the course of the evening and leave a lasting impact on everyone in the room. As Governor Evelyn Harper began to speak, her voice carried a calm authority that commanded attention. She introduced herself clearly, saying, "Good evening, everyone. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I'm the governor of this great state." Her tone was warm but firm, designed to reassure the crowd that she was there as an ally, not as someone distant or out of touch. She went on to explain how much she valued hearing directly from citizens like them, people who lived through the challenges they were discussing every single day. But just as she started to share some of her ideas for improving relations between communities and law enforcement, a man in uniform stepped forward from the side of the room. He was tall, with a stern expression, and wore a badge clipped to his belt. It was clear he wasn't part of the official meeting. He looked more like someone keeping an eye on things casually. At first, no one paid him much attention. But then, without warning, he raised his hand and interrupted her mid-sentence. "Excuse me," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the quiet room like a knife. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside. You're disrupting the meeting." His words hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. The audience exchanged confused glances. Disrupting? Evelyn had barely begun speaking. Before anyone could react, the officer continued, his tone growing firmer. "This isn't your place. Please leave now." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Some attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Others leaned forward, their curiosity piqued by the sudden confrontation. Evelyn, however, didn't flinch. She stood still at the microphone, her posture steady, her face unreadable. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The officer's demand echoed in the tense silence, heavy with implications far beyond what either of them might have intended. Evelyn finally broke the quiet, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "Sir," she said evenly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I am the governor of this state, and I'm here to listen and contribute to this important conversation." Her words were polite yet pointed, inviting the officer to reconsider his stance. But instead of backing down, he only grew more insistent. "I don't care who you say you are," he replied, raising his voice slightly. "You're causing a scene, and I'm asking you nicely to leave. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to take further action." His words sent a murmur through the crowd. People began whispering to each other, some defending Evelyn while others speculated about why the officer was acting so aggressively. Was it because she was black, because she was a woman, or simply because she didn't fit his idea of what a governor should look like? The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Evelyn kept her composure, refusing to let frustration creep into her voice. Instead, she addressed the officer directly, turning the situation into an opportunity to highlight the very issues being discussed that evening. "Officer," she said calmly, "does my presence here make you uncomfortable? Does it challenge your assumptions about who belongs in spaces like this?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered but impossible to ignore. For a brief moment, the officer hesitated. Then, shaking his head as if trying to regain control of the situation, he repeated his demand once more. "Leave. Now." The crowd bristled, sensing the injustice unfolding before their eyes. Little did the officer know, his actions were about to reveal something far bigger than himself and change the trajectory of the entire evening. The room was thick with tension, the kind that makes it hard to breathe. Governor Evelyn Harper stood at the microphone, her calm demeanor unwavering despite the officer's repeated demands for her to leave. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was using the moment to shine a light on something much bigger than both of them. Her voice remained steady as she addressed the officer again, this time with a tone that carried both authority and compassion. "Officer," she said, leaning slightly toward the microphone so her words would carry clearly across the room, "if you're unsure about who I am, I encourage you to verify my identity. Call your supervisor or check online. But while we wait, let me ask you this. Why did you assume I didn't belong here? Why did you feel the need to silence me before hearing what I had to say?" Her questions weren't accusatory. They were thoughtful, probing, almost like she was inviting him to reflect on his own actions. But the officer wasn't ready to engage in that kind of conversation. His face hardened, and he crossed his arms over his chest, as if trying to assert dominance. "Ma'am, I don't have time for games," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "You're disrupting this meeting, plain and simple. If you won't leave willingly, I'll have to escort you out." The crowd gasped audibly, some people shifting in their seats, others exchanging worried glances. No one could believe what they were witnessing. A woman simply trying to speak being treated like an intruder. Evelyn didn't back down. Instead, she turned her attention to the audience, addressing them directly. "Friends," she began, her voice warm but resolute, "this is exactly why we're here tonight. We've gathered to talk about trust, accountability, and fairness within our communities. Yet here we are, facing a situation where assumptions and biases are playing out right in front of us." Her words struck a chord with many in the room. Heads nodded slowly, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. For the first time, the officer seemed uncertain, glancing around as if realizing he was losing control of the narrative. Still, he pressed on, unwilling to admit fault. "Governor or not, rules are rules," he muttered under his breath, though loudly enough for those nearby to hear. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of disappointment and resolve. "Rules," she echoed, her voice carrying just a hint of incredulity. "And what rule am I breaking by participating in a public forum designed for open discussion? Or is the real issue that I don't fit your idea of what a leader looks like?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence wavering. He opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself, perhaps sensing that anything he said next might only dig him deeper into trouble. Meanwhile, the crowd grew restless. A few people stood up, their faces etched with disbelief and anger. One woman shouted, "How dare you treat her this way?" Another man added, "She's the governor. Show some respect." Despite the growing commotion, Evelyn remained composed, her presence commanding even without saying a word. She knew this moment was about more than just her. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or silenced because of how they looked or where they came from. And she refused to let fear or frustration dictate her response. Instead, she used the situation to drive home the very points she had come to discuss: the importance of listening, the danger of snap judgments, and the urgent need for mutual respect. Just when it seemed the confrontation might escalate further, a young man sitting near the front pulled out his phone and quickly typed something into a search engine. Within seconds, he found what he was looking for: a photo of Governor Evelyn Harper, along with her official biography. His eyes widened as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. Without hesitation, he jumped to his feet, holding up his phone for everyone to see. "Wait," he exclaimed, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is the governor. Look." The room fell silent once more, all eyes turning to the screen in the young man's hand. The officer froze, his face draining of color as the truth sank in. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the reality of the situation began to dawn on everyone, including the officer himself. What had started as a routine town hall meeting had transformed into something far more profound, exposing cracks in the foundation of trust and understanding that society so desperately needed to repair. The young man's voice rang out like a gavel striking the final blow, silencing the room instantly. "This is the governor," he repeated, holding up his phone so everyone could see the undeniable proof: a picture of Governor Evelyn Harper in her official capacity, smiling confidently beside the state seal. The image was clear, unmistakable, and impossible to refute. For a moment, time seemed to stop as the weight of the situation settled over the crowd. The officer, who had been so adamant just moments before, now looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. His arms, once crossed firmly over his chest, dropped to his sides. He blinked rapidly, his face pale and stricken with disbelief. It was obvious that he hadn't expected this outcome. Perhaps he'd assumed she was exaggerating, or even lying when she identified herself earlier. Now, confronted with irrefutable evidence, there was nowhere for him to hide. The air felt heavy, charged with a mix of shock, embarrassment, and simmering anger. Governor Harper didn't gloat or revel in the officer's discomfort. Instead, she stood quietly at the microphone, her expression calm but piercing. She let the silence stretch long enough for the gravity of the moment to sink in, not just for the officer, but for everyone present. Then, with deliberate slowness, she spoke. "Officer," she said, her tone measured but tinged with sadness, "I understand that mistakes happen. But I want you to think about why this mistake happened. Why did you assume I didn't belong here? Why did my presence make you feel threatened?" Her words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through the audience. Some people nodded vigorously, while others whispered among themselves, their voices filled with indignation. One elderly woman near the front muttered loudly enough for those around her to hear, "It's because she's black. That's why." The comment drew murmurs of agreement from several attendees, underscoring the uncomfortable truth that lingered in the room. The officer shifted uneasily, clearly aware that all eyes were on him now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stammered out an apology. "Ma'am, Governor Harper, I'm sorry, he said, his voice trembling. I didn't recognize you, and I acted too quickly. Please forgive me. His words were sincere, but they carried the weight of someone who knew he'd made a grave error, one that went far beyond mere oversight. He glanced around the room, perhaps hoping for some sign of forgiveness, but most faces remained impassive, their expressions unreadable. Evelyn nodded slowly, accepting his apology without hesitation. "Thank you for acknowledging your mistake," she replied, her voice steady and kind. "But let's use this as a learning moment, for all of us. This is exactly why we're here tonight, to talk about trust, accountability, and how our biases shape the way we treat one another. None of us are perfect, but we can always strive to do better." Her response disarmed the tension in the room, transforming what could have been a divisive moment into something constructive. People began clapping softly at first, then louder, until the entire space erupted in applause. It wasn't just for Evelyn. It was for the courage she showed in turning a personal affront into an opportunity for growth. Even the officer managed a weak smile, though it was clear he was still grappling with his own emotions. As the meeting resumed, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Attendees approached the microphone with renewed energy, sharing stories and ideas with a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. Many referenced the incident directly, using it as an example of the very issues they wanted to address. One young mother tearfully recounted how she often avoided public spaces out of fear of being judged unfairly, while a college student talked about feeling invisible in predominantly white settings. Each story added layers to the conversation, making it richer and more meaningful. For Evelyn, the rest of the evening passed in a blur. She listened intently to every speaker, nodding and jotting notes in a small notebook she kept tucked under her arm. Though the confrontation with the officer had been unexpected and undoubtedly painful, it had also opened doors that might otherwise have stayed closed. By the end of the meeting, the crowd seemed united in purpose, determined to turn their shared frustration into action. As Evelyn packed up her things and prepared to leave, several attendees approached her to express gratitude. Some thanked her for staying composed under pressure. Others praised her for turning the moment into a teachable experience. By the time Governor Evelyn Harper left the community center that evening, the incident had already begun to spread like wildfire. Attendees who had recorded snippets of the confrontation on their phones quickly uploaded them to social media, captioning the videos with phrases like "Governor mistaken for intruder" and "powerful moment at town hall." Within hours, the story exploded online, drawing reactions from across the state, and soon the entire country. News outlets picked up the footage almost immediately, replaying the tense exchange between Evelyn and the officer in vivid detail. Clips of her calm yet pointed response went viral, with commentators praising her poise under pressure. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags like #RespectTheGovernor and #ListenTour as people shared their thoughts about the broader implications of the incident. Some posts celebrated Evelyn's leadership and grace, while others highlighted the uncomfortable truths it revealed about bias and discrimination. But not everyone agreed on what had happened or what it meant. While many praised Evelyn for handling the situation with dignity, others rushed to defend the officer, arguing that he was simply doing his job. Online debates rage, with some users claiming the incident was blown out of proportion and others accusing critics of overlooking systemic issues. Tensions flared further when a local news station interviewed the officer, who apologized publicly but insisted he hadn't acted out of malice. "I didn't recognize her," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "It was a mistake, plain and simple." Despite the divided opinions, one thing was clear: the incident had struck a nerve. For many Black women and other marginalized groups, it resonated deeply, serving as yet another reminder of the daily indignities they faced. Countless stories poured in from people sharing their own experiences of being dismissed, questioned, or treated unfairly based on their appearance. A teacher recounted how she'd been mistaken for cafeteria staff during a parent-teacher conference. A doctor described being ignored by patients who assumed she couldn't possibly be in charge. These personal accounts added fuel to the growing conversation, turning what might have been a fleeting news story into a national reckoning. Amid the chaos, Governor Harper released a carefully worded statement urging calm and understanding. "What happened last night was unfortunate, but it also provides us with an opportunity to reflect and grow," she wrote. "Let us focus on fostering dialogue rather than deepening divisions. Let us work together to build a society where everyone feels seen, heard, and respected." Her message struck a chord, earning praise from leaders on both sides of the political aisle. Even those who disagreed with her policies acknowledged her ability to rise above conflict and inspire unity. As the days passed, the fallout continued to unfold. Local officials called for an internal investigation into the officers' conduct, promising transparency and accountability. Community activists organized rallies and forums to discuss racial profiling and implicit bias, using the incident as a springboard for change. Meanwhile, Evelyn became a symbol of resilience, her name trending alongside calls for greater representation and equity in leadership roles. Yet despite the whirlwind of attention, Evelyn remained focused on the bigger picture. She knew the real challenge wasn't just addressing one officer's actions, it was dismantling the underlying attitudes that allowed such moments to happen in the first place. During interviews and public appearances, she emphasized the importance of empathy and education, encouraging people to examine their own biases and assumptions. "We all carry stereotypes with us, whether we realize it or not," she told a reporter during a live segment. "The key is recognizing them and choosing to act differently." Her words resonated far beyond the confines of the small suburb where the incident occurred. Schools incorporated the story into classroom discussions about prejudice and privilege. Workplaces held training sessions on cultural sensitivity, citing Evelyn's example as a model for handling difficult situations. And in communities across the state, people began having honest conversations about race, power, and belonging, conversations that might never have happened without that fateful night. For Evelyn, the overwhelming response was both humbling and motivating. She understood that being thrust into the spotlight came with challenges, but she also saw it as a chance to drive meaningful change. As the weeks went on, she threw herself into advocacy work. In the days following the incident, the officer involved found himself at the center of an intense investigation. Local authorities placed him on administrative leave, citing the need for a thorough review of his actions during the town hall meeting. The decision sparked mixed reactions. Some community members argued that he deserved a second chance, pointing out that everyone makes mistakes. Others, however, felt that his behavior was emblematic of deeper issues within law enforcement, issues that couldn't be resolved with a simple suspension or apology. Governor Evelyn Harper chose not to weigh in publicly on the specifics of the investigation. Instead, she focused her energy on addressing the root causes behind such incidents. She met privately with local leaders, police chiefs, and activists to discuss ways to rebuild trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. These meetings weren't easy. Emotions ran high, and disagreements often surfaced. But Evelyn approached each conversation with patience and determination, emphasizing the importance of collaboration over blame. One particularly powerful meeting took place in a modest church basement, where Evelyn sat down with a group of residents who had long felt ignored by those in power. They shared stories of being stopped without cause, of feeling unsafe around officers sworn to protect them, and of struggling to have their voices heard. Evelyn listened intently, nodding along as they spoke. When it was her turn to respond, she didn't offer empty promises or platitudes. Instead, she acknowledged their pain and vowed to use her position to advocate for systemic change. "I hear you," she said, leaning forward slightly to make eye contact with each person in the room. "And I want you to know that your experiences matter. What happened to me at the town hall? It wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. It reminded me why we can't afford to stay silent when we see injustice." Her words resonated deeply with the group, many of whom left the meeting feeling hopeful for the first time in years. Inspired by their courage, Evelyn began working closely with lawmakers to draft new policies aimed at increasing accountability and transparency within law enforcement. Among the proposals were mandatory bias training programs, stricter guidelines for officer conduct during public events, and the creation of independent oversight boards to review complaints against police. But Evelyn knew that policy changes alone wouldn't solve everything. Real progress required more than legislation. It demanded a shift in mindset. To encourage this, she launched a statewide initiative called Bridging the Divide, which brought together officers and community members for open dialogues about race, respect, and mutual understanding. These sessions weren't always comfortable. In fact, some were downright tense, but they provided a safe space for people to express their fears, frustrations, and hopes for the future. The officer involved in the incident also participated in one of these dialogues, though reluctantly at first. Sitting across from residents who had been directly affected by similar encounters, he struggled to find the right words. At times, he grew defensive, insisting that he hadn't intended to offend anyone. But as the conversations continued, something shifted. He began listening more intently, allowing himself to see the world through others' eyes. By the end of the session, he offered a heartfelt apology, not just to Evelyn, but to everyone in the room. For Evelyn, moments like these reinforced her belief in the power of dialogue. While the road ahead remained challenging, she refused to lose sight of the progress being made. Every small victory, a changed perspective, a strengthened relationship, a new policy implemented, was a step toward healing the wounds that divided communities. And though the incident at the town hall had been painful, it ultimately served as a catalyst for growth, reminding everyone involved that even the most difficult moments could lead to transformation if approached with humility and hope. The incident at the town hall didn't just spark conversations, it ignited a movement. Across the state, grassroots organizations and community leaders rallied around Governor Evelyn Harper's call for change, using her experience as a rallying cry to address long-standing issues of racial profiling, bias, and inequality. What began as a single moment of confrontation grew into a wave of activism that reached far beyond the small suburb where it all started. In cities and towns throughout the state, people organized marches, vigils, and workshops under banners reading, "Respect starts here," and "Justice for all." These events weren't just about protesting. They were about educating, inspiring, and uniting. At one rally in the state capitol, hundreds gathered to hear speeches from local activists, educators, and even some law enforcement officials who supported reform. A young woman named Maya, whose viral video of the town hall incident had helped bring national attention to the story, stood at the podium and addressed the crowd. "We're here today because we refuse to stay silent," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Governor Harper showed us what grace looks like in the face of injustice. Now it's our turn to show courage, to stand up, speak out, and demand better." Her words earned thunderous applause, and many attendees left the rally feeling empowered to take action in their own communities. Schools became unexpected hubs of this growing movement. Teachers incorporated discussions about bias and representation into their lesson plans, encouraging students to think critically about fairness and equality. In one high school, a group of teenagers launched a campaign called "See Me, Hear Me," aimed at challenging stereotypes and promoting inclusivity. They created posters featuring portraits of diverse individuals alongside quotes about their dreams and struggles, which they displayed not only in their school but also in libraries, coffee shops, and community centers across town. Even businesses joined the effort. Corporate leaders attended seminars on cultural sensitivity, while companies pledged to diversify their hiring practices and create more inclusive workplaces. One tech startup introduced a program to mentor young women of color interested in careers in STEM fields, inspired by Evelyn's trailblazing example as a Black woman in leadership. The governor herself made appearances at several of these initiatives, offering encouragement and sharing stories of her own journey to break barriers. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued traveling across the state, attending forums and meeting with residents eager to share their ideas for change. She often brought along members of her policy team, ensuring that the voices of everyday citizens directly influenced new legislation. During one particularly memorable visit to a rural farming community, she listened as farmers expressed concerns about how racial biases affected interactions with agricultural inspectors. Their honesty led to revisions in training protocols for government workers, proving that no issue was too small to address. As momentum built, so did media coverage. National news outlets featured stories about the grassroots campaigns springing up in response to the governor's experience. Talk show hosts invited Evelyn onto their programs to discuss her vision for a fairer society, while late-night comedians joked about the irony of someone failing to recognize a sitting governor. But beneath the humor lay a serious message. Assumptions and biases harm real people every day, and addressing them requires collective effort. Perhaps most significantly, the movement inspired collaboration between groups that had previously been divided. Law enforcement agencies partnered with civil rights organizations to host joint training sessions. Faith leaders from different denominations came together to lead interfaith dialogues on justice and reconciliation. Even political rivals set aside differences to co-sponsor bills aimed at reducing systemic inequities. It was clear that Evelyn's ability to turn adversity into action had touched something universal, a shared desire for progress. By the time autumn gave way to winter, the impact of the movement could be seen everywhere. New policies were being implemented, relationships were being repaired, and attitudes were slowly shifting. People who had once felt powerless now believed they could make a difference. And through it all, Evelyn remained a steadfast figurehead, not because she sought the spotlight, but because she understood that true leadership meant standing beside others as they found their own strength. The seed planted by an uncomfortable moment at a town hall had grown into something extraordinary, a testament to the resilience of a community determined to build a brighter future. Months after the incident at the town hall, Governor Evelyn Harper stood on stage at a national civil rights conference, her presence commanding yet warm. The room was filled with activists, scholars, and everyday citizens who had come together to discuss progress and challenges in the fight for equality. As she adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces, Evelyn took a deep breath. This moment wasn't just about reflecting on what had happened. It was about celebrating how far they'd come and acknowledging the work still ahead. "I never imagined," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "that one evening in a small community center would change my life. And perhaps yours, forever." She paused, letting her words sink in. "What happened to me that night was painful, yes. But it also reminded me of something important. Our struggles can become stepping stones if we choose to use them wisely." Evelyn went on to share how the incident had transformed not only her perspective, but also the trajectory of her state's efforts toward justice and equity. She spoke about the grassroots campaigns, the policy changes, and the countless conversations that had taken place, because people refused to let the moment pass unnoticed. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "It happens when ordinary people decide they won't settle for the status quo. It happens when we listen to each other, even when it's hard. And it happens when we turn pain into purpose." Her speech earned a standing ovation, but Evelyn wasn't there for accolades. For her, this was an opportunity to remind everyone that the journey was far from over. While significant strides had been made, new laws passed, biases confronted, bridges built, there were still communities fighting for recognition, still individuals facing discrimination daily. Evelyn urged the audience to remain vigilant, to keep pushing for fairness even when progress felt slow or invisible. Back home, the impact of her leadership continued to ripple outward. Schools named scholarships after her, honoring students who demonstrated resilience and commitment to social justice. Community centers hosted annual forums inspired by her call for open dialogue. Even the officer involved in the incident became an advocate for reform, speaking candidly at training sessions about the dangers of unchecked assumptions. His transformation served as proof that no one was beyond redemption if they were willing to learn and grow. As time passed, Evelyn's story became more than just a headline. It became a lesson etched into history. Textbooks included it as an example of grace under pressure and the power of turning adversity into action. Young girls, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, looked up to her as a role model, seeing in her a reflection of their own potential. Evelyn often visited schools to speak with these students, encouraging them to dream big and stand firm in the face of obstacles. "You don't have to be perfect to lead," she told them during one visit. "You just have to care enough to try." Years later, when Evelyn reflected on her legacy, she didn't dwell on titles or awards. What mattered most to her was the knowledge that she had helped plant seeds of hope in places where despair once grew. Communities that had once felt divided now worked together. Conversations that had once been avoided were now happening openly. And while prejudice hadn't disappeared entirely, its grip had loosened thanks to the collective efforts of those who dared to believe in a better future. In the end, Evelyn's story wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had joined the movement she inadvertently sparked. From the young woman who filmed the viral video to the farmers advocating for fair treatment, from the teenagers leading school initiatives to the officers rethinking their roles, each person played a part in shaping a new narrative. Together, they proved that moments of injustice could be turned into catalysts for change, if only people had the courage to act. And so, Governor Evelyn Harper's legacy endured, not as a tale of one woman's triumph, but as a testament to the enduring power of unity, resilience, and hope.